I occasionally think how quickly our differences worldwide would vanish if we were facing an alien threat from outside this world. And yet I ask you, is not an alien force already among us?
From the gates of Mount Rome to the far corners of the endless highway, wherever you are, welcome to the show.
So you believe in some kind of Armageddon?
Yeah, most definitely. We in the last times and days right now. The Illuminati's in effect.
Joining me today is author, researcher, and I think he has dabbled in some docu-film work as of late, the Joshua Cutchin. Thanks for coming on, man.
It's a pleasure to be here. And yes, I've just taken my first real steps into that documentary world, which is a completely different kettle of fish, but it's enjoyable. You know, you get to a certain point, you're like, what do I do next? So alongside still writing books, this seems like a natural progression.
I think so too. I'd love to step into that world someday as well. I think when you get, especially in someone like your case, you have all these books out, you're always kind of parsing through ideas. It does seem like maybe it would be a natural jump to go to film and to documentaries.
Yeah, that's part of it. You know, a big part of it is that people don't read. Which kills me. It wounds my soul, but it's just the reality. And audiobooks for my stuff tend to be tricky. I've got a good friend of mine who's working on an audiobook of my novel, but you know, when you look at something like my most requested audiobook, Ecology of Souls, it's 260,000 words, and doing it yourself is a recipe for madness, and having someone else do it is a recipe for a lot of ramen noodles in your future. So yeah, so it's like, well, okay, well, what other ways are there to get these ideas in front of people? And you know, it's interesting. I feel like the sort of the openness to some of the different ways that I tend to look at these topics is becoming more mainstream, and people just in general are becoming more mainstream to the stuff that we're interested in. So it's just it's a interesting,
I agree
a different strategy, I guess.
Yeah. You know what? I'm glad you said that because you said something that always stuck with me. You said this years ago in an interview.
Okay.
And I think you were talking about writing begin writing a fairy book or a Bigfoot book, but you said it's a rather big moment in life when you decide to be associated with these things.
Yeah, that's definitely a thing.
Boy, have I felt that.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't I mean, job applications have gotten significantly dystopian even since I was really on the hunt for them. You know, all the automation and searching for keywords and stuff where you have to rewrite your resume over and over again. But I dare say that if I were to try that process again, I don't know. You know, I have mixed feelings. You know, part of me thinks that it would be even worse because people would see all the kooky ideas that I'm attached to in the UFO sphere. But on the other hand, you know, people are more open to these topics than they have been in a long time. And I think that, you know, not to jump too far into the weeds right off the bat, nor to take sort of control of the conversation, but you know,
No, let's go.
If you've been following me that long, you know that I've been sort of you know, historically pretty critical of the disclosure movement, such as it is. But this time around, I think that something has changed in a pretty significant way, and I don't think that, you know, there's any sort of capital T truth coming down the pike anytime soon, but there has been that shift, which, you know, I would liken to, the Kennedy assassination, right? 15
Mm.
years ago, a significant portion of the population thought that the official story was true, and nowadays nobody thinks the official story is true. So, I kind of detect a similar sort of shift in the vibe of the person on the street regarding UFOs. And once you open the door to UFOs, man, a lot of other stuff comes rushing in
It
after that.
does. It does. I mean, anyone who's ever browsed a John Keel novel or book, I should say, will know that there's a lot more baggage that comes with this, whether you get into it via UFOs or fairies or Bigfoot or whatever. There seems to be common threads, and that's another thing I see kind of paralleling disclosure and this openness that we're talking about. And like I remember Art Bell used to talk about the quickening back in like the 90s, I think. And he wrote a book called The Quickening, and it seems like things were, speeding up, almost like we're like being rushed into this new awakening, or some sort of a strange contemporary enlightenment that we don't have a term for yet. And part of that is that people, I think, are not sticking in their camps as much, because you used to have the Bigfoot people over here and the UFO people over there, but then you've got people like me and maybe even yourself who say, well, hold on, there might be some connective tissue here.
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely ascribe to, if not one phenomenon, then certainly the phenomena, plural, are related. And that's always sort of baffled me why you'll get the ghost hunters making fun of the Bigfoot people and the Bigfoot people making fun of the ghost hunters. It's like I said this in a conversation earlier today. It's like this is a whole neighborhood of glass houses. Like,
Yeah.
like we're all living in one. To the average person, we're all a little bit wacky. And I'm not saying that certain ideas don't have more or less merit than others, but on the broadest, 10,000 foot view, yeah, I mean UFOs, the fairy stuff, spirits, and cryptozoology. I mean, all of those have their own strengths to bring to the table that suggest that something beyond our typical mundane explanations is going on.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I might back up a little bit.
Yeah. So like I said,
And
I didn't mean to drag us deep
No, I
right off
love
the
jumping
bat.
in deep. That happens all, I don't know what it is, but that happens all the time on this show. We tend to jump right in the deep end, and I'm totally fine with it. But I did want to ask you, well, let me say this because I don't know that a book has come up more than Where the Footprints In on this
Mhm.
show. It gets mentioned frequently. Sometimes it's during the show, sometimes after, but it always seems to be being brought up. So, on that note, I have to say your work is current, your work is relevant. How did you get into the subject?
Oh my goodness. Well, that's very encouraging to hear that it's still around. I find it very funny that it's quite heavily reviewed on Amazon, and I still haven't been invited to a Bigfoot conference, but maybe that's a conversation for another day. I think there's some things in there that a lot of the mainstream Bigfooters don't want to hear.
Oh.
Um,
Hmm.
it's kind of funny though, and it's ironic because I was like my biggest, earliest interest in all these topics was Bigfoot. I was like I had Jeff Meldrum books growing up, and I was always like, I was just a kind of a Bigfoot nerd. That was my first love when it came to these Fortean topics. And as I sort of went along through flash forward, we don't have to rehash this story because I've told it plenty of times elsewhere. But once I started looking at the subject matter for my first book, it was sort of a Bigfoot connection and a Bigfoot book that got me there. The similarities between some indigenous Alaskan beliefs and this fairy food taboo that you see in Western Europe. Um,
Can you
so
tell that? I'm not familiar
sure,
with
yeah,
that one.
sure.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, no, you're good. Long story short, I picked up a copy of J. Robert Alley's Raincoast Sasquatch. It's a great book.
Oh.
And in it he mentions that one of the tribes in Alaska believes that if you accept food from the Bequus,
Mm.
their Bigfoot analog, you'll be trapped with the Bequus forever. And that's a literal version of the Western European food taboo that if you accept
Mm.
food from the fairies in fairyland, you're stuck with the fairies forever. And as I dug and in the years since writing my first book, A Trojan Feast, I've found out that this really is one of those universal themes. Accepting food in the land of the dead, you're stuck with the dead, or accepting food from the other, you become a part of or attached to the other forever. And that was the story. That was the story for my first book. So like I was always kind
Hmm.
of so after that point, I was like, okay, there's possibly some high strangeness regarding Bigfoot, but I was still personally kind of ignoring it more, and I really wanted there to be a flesh and blood Bigfoot, that we could,
Yeah.
capture, and a specimen that we could maybe capture and examine someday. Um, but as you progress through these topics, and let me know if this sort of echoes your experience as well. You sort of enter in with this wide-eyed wonder. Well, you
Hmm.
probably begin a skeptic, and then you enter in with this wide-eyed wonder, and you sort of believe everything. And then the more you think about it, you're like, well, this doesn't add up, and this doesn't add up, and this doesn't add up. And then at that point, you're sort of faced with a fork in the road, which is, okay, well, it all really was a bunch of hogwash all along, or you try to find a way to reconcile this because you talk to people who are very clear and very adamant and very reliable who have had these experiences, but some of the basic logical stuff doesn't add up. And Bigfoot kind of is a case study in that because, you know, I do resonate with a lot of the skeptical arguments surrounding Bigfoot. I think that if it's a mundane biological specimen, we should have a body.
Yeah.
We should have more sightings. And I'm a well aware of all the counter arguments that the cryptozoologists like to trot out, like, oh, we don't find bear carcasses that often or mountain lion carcasses that often. And it's like, yeah, we don't, but we have at some point,
Yes.
we've had that smoking gun. And so you hear all these stories that seem to support the skeptical argument, but then you talk to these people, you talk to these hunters who have literally hunted bear for 40 years, and then they're approached by something, they're like, it wasn't a bear.
Right.
And you hear all these. So how do you make those two things play together? Like, how do you reconcile those two things? And then if you go, deep enough into this, and you're kind of looking for your next high, as it turns out, you start hearing the stranger stories and start becoming more interested in the stranger tales of Bigfoot, as if Bigfoot wasn't strange enough. You've got these tales that sound absolutely bonkers about,
Yeah.
disappearing in front of your eyes and, being associated with anomalous light phenomena. And you say, oh, well, for me, well, it's like, oh, this is a way for this thing for the eyewitness sightings to exist and be authentic, but also for us to not have more evidence. And there's a whole another layer of counter arguments we can discuss later if you want to.
Sure.
But
Well, I'll just
yeah.
add this and let you keep going, but it's almost like with any subject, almost, the more you look into something, and I mean really look into it, the weirder it's going to get. It's like
Mm,
that with alchemy, it's like that with religion. You find stuff that you didn't know about, and it's like, that's strange. And especially subjects that have any kind of tie whatsoever to the supernatural.
mhm.
It's going to get weirder the more you look into it. So,
Yeah, everything has an exoteric side and an esoteric side. There's a
mhm.
side that's sort of more for public for mass consumption, and a side that's for people who really start to dig deeper. Um, so I was starting to entertain more the idea of there being a supernatural component to Bigfoot. And just as a brief aside, um, if ghosts leave behind footprints and ghosts can slam doors, I see no reason that something more supernatural that we call Bigfoot couldn't leave behind hairs and footprints, right?
Right.
But so Tim Renner approached me and wanted to sort of do the definitive guide to weird Bigfoot, almost like an encyclopedia. And we talked back and forth because I was going to take a break at the time. Was getting ready to be a dad, and it felt like a good time to take a break. And Tim said, "No, you're going to do this with me." And it evolved into Where the Footprints End, which was much like my last book, Ecology of Souls. It was conceived as one book, Where the Footprints End, but it became apparent that we should probably split it in half. And the reception to it was more than we could have ever hoped. It
Mm.
seems like there are a lot of people whose stories are not getting heard. They're sort of getting tossed in the wastebasket at some of the large report gathering organizations. That's a diplomatic way to put it. Um, but it seemed to really hit at the right moment. And also, I think the fact that it has sort of the staying power that you alluded to suggests that there's something in there that is worth further examination. And the analogy that I always use is that, you can find a ufologist who's very wedded to the idea that UFOs are extraterrestrial craft, but then you get them after their lecture to the hotel bar, and you get a couple of drinks in them, and you start asking them about the phenomenon, and then they'll start bringing up spiritual revelations and synchronicities and these things that they don't present in their public facing life. And similarly, I've found that with the Bigfoot people too. A lot of the times, if you can get them to drop their guard when they're not lecturing in front of an audience, you can get them to say, well, there was this one time when we went to our usual hot spot where we always see Bigfoot, and we didn't see Bigfoot, but we did see these strange lights, or I did hear a car door slam out in the middle of the wilderness and stuff
Right.
like that, and it's like,
It's
well,
there. It's
yeah,
just
it's
if
there.
people are being honest, they'll tell you exactly what you just laid out. They will say, "Well, there was this one time." Things always get weirder, and I
Yeah,
think that there's like a public perception thing that people want to maintain to where they don't. They want to have safe arguments and they want to kind of stick to the safe stuff. But
yeah,
but I mean, I appreciate guys like with you and Tim. Uh, Getting together. It's almost like a super group, which y'all did with that. Just you guys are like two powerhouses. I mean, like he came on the show and like I maintained that it's one of my best episodes of all time and probably always will be. It's just because he's refreshing to listen to, like yourself, because you guys bring perspective that's outside of the mainstream or what's perceived to be the mainstream comfort
right.
zone.
Well, there are a couple things going on here. I mean, number one is the fact that any of these topics are hard enough to get the general populace to entertain. So, I think that's a large reason why we often talk about UFOs in terms of extraterrestrials and often talk about Bigfoot in terms of an undiscovered hominid is because that's an easier ask of the general public than, you know, uh archetypal manifestation of the wild man or whatever you want to do. So
Yes.
that's part of it, but there's also this thing that my mentor Greg Bishop calls the certainty fetish, which is this like idea that you're wedded to a concept or an explanation. And I detect in some circles of cryptozoology this like this need to get to the end of for there someday to be a specimen that's discovered and they get to say I told you so to all the skeptics, right? And I feel like if you take more of your ego out of it, and again, I'm not saying that I'm perfect about that. Everybody's got their ego and everything, right? But if you can just
Mhm.
sort of look at the evidence dispassionately, you do wind up with like this thing, whatever it is strange. And there are people who know what they're seeing who are being very honest and forthcoming with me. So, again, how do you make those two things? How do you reconcile those two things? And,
Hmm.
and it does lead you to strange places. But I'm sure that you found this too. That's the journey of all these topics. You get interested in these little niche areas and you find yourself exploring stuff that you would never in a million years would have looked into. I mean, you just said alchemy, right? Like,
Yeah,
like,
yeah, yeah.
like, if I don't know I don't know the extent of your background and your journey, but like, would you have looked into alchemy if you weren't interested in all these other sensationalist subjects?
No,
Like,
no,
no, no.
no, no.
But
And
yeah,
it's because at that fork in the road, I guess,
yep,
after you have an experience, instead of going left, I guess I went right or whatever, because I went down the road because I was still trying to reconcile.
right, right.
And it's led me to all these other topics. And this whole other world, like Narnia, has just opened up for me. And it's great. I love it. But I'm the kind of person, I guess, inclined to like weird stuff because I've always been a weirdo.
Yeah,
But I find it fascinating. And yeah, I'm still trying to reconcile stuff, and I change my views a lot, probably more often than I'd like to admit. I had a guy on six
that's good.
months ago.
I think that's a virtue though. So don't ever lose that. Like, yeah,
Yeah, it's just, it's a journey and I'm trying. Yeah, thank you. But like, I had Graham Rendell on. He's a UFO author. At the time, I didn't really agree with his perspective on things. This was like 6 months ago, probably. Now, I need to have him back on because I think we see eye to eye on a lot more stuff. He was very skeptical about Roswell and a bunch of other cases that
Mhm.
I brought up, and at the time I was all in on those being what they're presented as in all the
Mhm.
documentaries essentially.
Yeah.
Now I don't know. I think there might be something bigger going on behind all that, orchestrating that, and maybe there are some psyops involved. And
Yeah.
back to your work, this would be a question I'd have for you. And I mean, now we're in the deep end, I guess, so I'm just going to go with it. uh, when you look at thousands of years of fairy lore, and then sometime in the 1900s, maybe around 1947, maybe a little before, you start to see that maybe shifting into UFOs and aliens and humanoids and green men. Do you see a shift there, or did something else just show up on the scene?
It's a good question. I mean, so I've recently changed my tune. I've got a new book coming out in April called Fourth Wall Phantoms that's about sort of the influence of fiction on whatever this thing is.
Yeah.
And again, not saying it's all in your head, saying that this thing likes to pick bits and pieces out of our cherished fictions. And in there, I sort of address a little bit of where I've landed on this because for the longest time, I was just, I was, if you had to like really be reductive with what I thought, it was like aliens or fairies, right? That's what we call them aliens. They were once called fairies. The more nuanced version of that, which I still stand by to a degree, is that whatever is behind the phenomenon um, decided to change from appearing as fairies to appearing as aliens. But I've
Wow.
moved off of that a little bit in the sense that I have to be honest here. People see aliens and they still see fairies, right?
Right.
So it's not an either or sort of
Hmm.
proposition. I think that there is this thing. I don't know what it is. I don't know if it comes from us. I don't know if it's outside of us. I don't know if it's the Gaia and Earth mind. I don't know what it is. But there is something else here with us that seems and presents itself as exterior and autonomous that added to its repertoire aliens. So you still get fairies, but it's just another. It's like it's like buying another Halloween costume.
Yeah,
Imagine
that's
you imagine
interesting.
yeah. Yeah, so that's sort of where I've landed with that. And there's just and there was a time too when I would be like, well, it looks quite similar, but I've reached the point where I see too many similarities to ignore. I mean, example that I really like bringing up is that I didn't really quite know how to reconcile alien implants and the fairy stuff because that doesn't seem like a very fairy sort of thing. But um, I later discovered that there was a tradition in certain parts of Europe about the fairy blast, which is a big gust of wind. The words blast, blister, and blustery all share the same root word because a fairy could that you offended, they would send a blast of wind that would cause a blister on your skin. And once you opened it up, it would be filled with just mundane things like
Mhm.
a fragment of tooth or bone or a twig or even hair or string or something. And that sounds quite similar to the alien implants, right?
Yeah,
Because every time
sure.
they open them up, almost every time they open them up, they present themselves as being just a mundane piece of material, like a piece of glass that got under your skin and became calcified and stuff.
It's almost like
So
they
yeah.
updated a method there. So,
Yeah, yeah, and I think to that end, like I think we're kind of overdue for a reskin of the phenomenon. I think we kind of it's an interesting and exciting time because I think we got that a little bit
mhm.
recently. So another thing that Dr. Jacques Vallée pointed out was that the phenomenon, the craft themselves seem to sort of update as they go along, right? So you've got the steampunk airships in the early 20th century, and you've got the Art Nouveau flying saucers in the mid-century, and you've got black triangles in the 80s,
Sure.
and then for a while I was like, okay, well the next thing is drones, right? The next thing is drones
Ah,
because of the Tic Tac, right? And I had some friends who were like, yeah, but people aren't really seeing Tic Tacs and drones, and that all changed at the end of last year. So I think I called that one. I have to say, if I am gonna be a little bit egotistical, but the question is, what are the occupants going to update to? That's the question, and if I had to put money on them updating to something, I would not be surprised if, we revisited this podcast in 25 years, if we're both lucky enough to still be here. And the narrative hadn't shifted from like, oh, well, there are no aliens and there are no fairies, but the AI the AI robots came
Mm.
out of their underground server farms and they took me last night. I could see that being another mask that the phenomenon puts on with our changing times. But yeah, I just think it's a sort of a software update in a lot of ways.
Yeah, yeah. Wow, that's that's spot on. It does seem like there's been an update, and it seems like we've maybe taken a cultural jump too, in how like the collective feels about UFOs. Like there's a psychological element to this too.
Yeah,
Um,
definitely think there is.
I maybe this is a big question, maybe it's a conspiracy question, but what if there really was like an MJ-12 type of organization with the Vanover Bush types? And I think there's precedent for that. I do think there was a group like that, whether or not it was MJ-12 or not, I'm not sure. But
Mhm.
what if that group had their hands in like the DoD we know now like funds movies, right? What if shows like the X-Files were part of like a government program to sort of leak this information to us and get everyone sort of or comfortable with these ideas of UFOs?
Yeah, that's an idea that I've heard quite a bit. The idea of like soft disclosure or predictive programming. I mean, it's gone by a lot of different names. Being who I am, I like to go even weirder with it, right? And so there's this. It's again a lot of what my new book Fourth Wall Phantoms talks about. I'm not trying to shift this into promotion mode. It's just where
No,
my head is lately.
no, let's go there
Um,
because I wanted to talk about that anyway.
but there's a passage from I think it's Whitley Strieber's Breakthrough where he alludes to um, reading a memo from Wright-Patterson Air Force Base where it says that the visitors' presence here on Earth can be held at bay through the encouragement of disbelief in them. So basically, we're holding the alien invasion at bay by not believing in
Oh
the
yeah.
aliens. And look, I don't know what to do with that, right? Like, you know, part of the very subject matter of this new book, it's like I'm engaging with it and then I'm going to like step away from it because I have no idea what's real and what's not anymore. But what a wacky, interesting idea. And I mean, maybe that's the reason that every Hollywood movie ends with us defeating the aliens because it's actually holding up a literal phantasmagoria of aliens at bay. I don't
Yeah.
know. I don't
Or
know.
maybe it's just changing, it's just adapting. I've been thinking about something you said a minute ago with the AI component to this. That's super interesting, especially when you look at like Gordy Rose and Seymour Cray and these guys that were part of like development of the computer age. There
Yeah.
seems to be a phenomenon there that those guys were engaging with.
Well, you know the Seymour Cray stories, right? About
Remind me.
so he'd be working on a problem and he would get frustrated. So he would go down to his basement and dig in this hole that he'd been digging in. Um,
Oh, the
and
elves.
in the elves, he would say that the elves would come across his desk and solve the problem, and then when he came back up, the elves would have solved it for him. I don't
Hmm.
know. Again, I don't know what to do with that. I don't know if that's a metaphor or if it means that he stepped back into his office and the solution was in his head, or if there was actually like Elvish written on a sticky note. I don't know,
Yeah.
but
I think
like,
some of that
yeah,
came to him through dreams if I what I read was correct. Like
yeah,
his wife
yeah.
knew about it and he would go dig, and if he wasn't presented with the answer from the elves then and there and somehow down there in the hole, he would go to sleep and he would have it in the morning. The idea would be fresh on his mind.
And that's the thing that I'm sure you're realizing too on your journey is that like even it's just it's like that old it was a John Jacob Astor somebody one of the guys who died on the Titanic uh quote it's millionaires don't believe in astrology, billionaires do,
Yes.
and
Yes.
I don't know if it was him, maybe it was JP Morgan or something, but uh but yeah, it's one of those things where like it's just the average person on the street doesn't believe in this, but anybody a lot sorry, not anybody, but a lot of the people who have fostered technological development, a lot of the people who are in authority structures have really strange things that they believe. I always find it funny that, if you were an American citizen, during the what was it, 70s, 80s, um, you were paying for remote viewing through your taxpayer dollars, even if you
Yeah.
didn't believe in it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's what was I was riding back from a gig with one of the guys in my band, and I said, what you soon find out is that everything has an occult angle. Chiropractic has origins in spiritualism.
I agree
Yeah.
100%. That's what I have found since I started this show. I always thought it was there somewhere running in the background, kind of like an enigma, just very obscure. But when you start looking into stuff, I think just goes well with something I was trying to articulate earlier when I said, when you look into things deeper, if there's a supernatural component, even somewhat, it's going to get weirder. I think this ties directly in with that. There's
Yep,
this
yep,
weird occult backdrop
yeah.
to all this stuff. With the Gordy Rose thing, he talked about, I guess he was developing AI in very early stages, and he said he was walking into like a room where they had a supercomputer, and he said the hum of it was like being in the presence of an alien god, and and then he would go on to like say other things in that same vein.
Yeah, and that's a weird thing to say when you consider how many experiences start with that humming sound that's
Yes.
so often
Oh, yeah.
reported. Yeah, that's
But
yeah. I mean, yeah, yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
well, no, that was I just want to tag that on because a lot of these guys involved with this with AI, even like, CERN releases the internet in the 90s. They had a guy there named Tim Berners-Lee who first released the www and the HTTP and all that. Um, they have a particle collider there. That stuff goes back to the Nazis. The Nazis first developed the particle collider in, I think, 43. It was a guy they had named Rolf Weiderow. He developed it for the Nazis. After the war, he went to work at CERN. And we know that the Nazis now, we know that they were very involved with all this occult stuff. And when you look at the Nazis, it's like, I'm going to try to tie this up. It's like, where did they get their knowledge? Because a lot of people go into the channeling or were they channeling? And it's like, were some of these advancements in technology, because a lot of them came from the Nazis. A lot of what we're cooking with right now came from the Nazis. Were some of this was this information passed along to us
It's
somehow?
yeah, it's the story of Project Paperclip, right? I mean, you look at
Yes.
how many technological developments are downstream of the space program, and how the space program was downstream of Paperclip, and it's like, you know,
Yeah.
it gets pretty icky really quick. Yeah, it's wild, and
And it reminds me
yeah.
of alchemy, actually. And like the origins of alchemy in Egypt, at least with the story of Isis, because she was a magician and she was doing angelic magic, and she actually had a breakthrough, and she started talking to an angel. That angel was not able to answer all of her questions, so that angel went and got a higher being, more like a higher angel.
Let me get my supervisor. Yeah.
Yeah, and that entity came down and liked Isis, found her, pleasurable to be around, and then sort of gave her the mysteries, and thus alchemy was born. But when you look at the Egyptian culture, it's like, was that developed or was it revealed? Because a
Mhm.
lot of that culture seems to have been revealed to them. Because we still don't know how they built pyramids and all that.
Yeah, I mean, and it's in like the carving of, I believe it's diorite, the
Hmm.
material, that's super hard material, and like the way that some of those things are machined. Yeah, I'm sympathetic to the idea that there's so much stuff that we just are guessing at happened in the past, and um, it seems I just think that human nature in a lot of ways doesn't change. So if we felt like our inspiration and our technologies were more or less Promethean in that sense, like they
Mm.
were handed down to us. Like, why would we feel any different about it today? When you talk to creative types and, quote unquote geniuses, and they'll always tell you, like, these ideas just popped into my head. I have no idea where they came from. Um, and yeah, if, I don't know what you do for, hobbies and such, but like that thing happens pretty regularly where this thing will just come to you out
I'm
of the
also a
blue.
musician, so I know
Okay, yeah, yeah.
exactly
So
what
yeah,
you're.
you get it. Yeah,
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 I
you
get
get it.
it.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, it's just like, I can sit here and sweat over um a composition or something for hours on end, but it's going to always be worse than something that pops into my mind when I'm making a sandwich. It's just the way it works.
Yeah, well, it's the muse. There's a mysticism about the muse. Even here in Nashville, I think the modern world, the modern person has kind of lost touch with this, but they still refer to the muse. But even if you go back, you do start to see that there is like this sort of a reaching past the veil to get ideas. People do that still, but they used to acknowledge it more. And
Right.
even here in Nashville, we have a 49-foot statue of Athena in a
I've been there.
Parthenon.
Yeah, I've been there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you talk to some people and they'll say, yeah, this is a nod to the artistic presence in Nashville. I know it goes back to the Greeks and all that, but like they'll tag that in there and it's almost like they're tying it in with the muse. And then you look at Nikola Tesla, Crowley, Carl Jung, Lovecraft.
Yeah.
In so many words or less, they all pretty much said that they got their ideas from somewhere else. Some of them
Yeah.
straight up said it was dictated to them, like Crowley.
Yeah, and there's that great quote that's been apocryphally attributed to Jung, which is, people don't have ideas, ideas have people. And, uh, you know, uh, it's hard to convey that unless you've been involved in like a creative endeavor. Like, I have some friends who are, computer science majors who would probably be like, what the hell are you talking about? But, but if you are involved in a creative process ever, like that thing is that sensation, that sense of something outside yourself can be shockingly tangible. And of course, it doesn't surprise me that, in our current disenchanted climate, we just say, "Oh, it's all about me. It was my idea. It just came to me. It was great. It just,
Right.
yeah,
I think that that's a very modern thing.
yeah, yeah. I would have to imagine it is.
Yeah.
Because honestly, I mean, we like to think that we've bagged and tagged and cataloged so many things, but like our entire approach to the way that we interface with the world is like a real blip. This whole post-war period, maybe if you want to be charitable and say, from the Renaissance on, maybe like that's a fraction of a fraction of the human experience on Earth. And look, I'm not saying that I don't love the fact that we have access to surgery and refrigerators and airplanes and you know, um, all these sort of things. But at the same time, like th those are technological outgrowths. They don't really sort of put a pin in. They don't have the same explicative power in terms of what reality is or the way that reality was set up. Like those are the questions that I think um, we might be better served in looking at some older traditions to get a better sense of how things work.
I agree with that. I was just having a conversation with a podcaster the other day about this book, Powwow, Long Lost Friend.
Oh yeah, yeah.
And actually, I talked to Timothy Renner about this too. He had a lot to say about this. He's very well informed on it. But, anyways, what we were talking about echoes what you just said, because I was trying to explain that I think this is a little out of grasp for a lot of modern people because you have to realize this was a time when people, like you said, did not have AC. Some of them didn't have refrigerators. They didn't have heat. They're living out in the elements. You have cows and chickens, and that's your livelihood. And you also have mountain lions and bears and other and wolves and stuff that are going to encroach on you. And then you have, feuds going on with the neighbor. You guys are fighting over land and there's no police to call. You've got all this stuff and you're out in the elements and you're in a constant battle with the elements. You need any kind of a supernatural helping hand that
Yeah.
you can get. And that's why this makes sense
Yeah, and
or
it's that's
did.
that no that's an interesting way to put it because this idea just occurred to me. So much of your daily life was left up to chance, right? It's like
Yeah.
I hope that this, cut doesn't get infected. I hope this and that. That was sort of the pre-technological or early technological era, right? And so to that end, um, this meat that I have might not spoil. It probably will, but how do I refine the chances of it not spoiling? well, refrigeration and technology can sort of shift the odds in your favor. And I've heard it described that that's basically what magic is, right? It's the shifting of odds in your favor. So in that sense, technology is quite literally magic, you know.
Yes.
You're enacting your will upon our reality.
Yeah, it's a
That's
spiritual
that's
technology.
before you even get to some of the stuff we were talking about earlier about the occult origins of some
Hmm.
possible occult origins of some of our technology as well. So yeah, I mean it all seems really consistent to me, and I just I know just enough about the occult to be dangerous, I guess. I've always sort of kept it at arm's length, but
Well, I'm starting
there's
to
something
see
to it. Yeah.
a reinsurgence of it into these type of conversations, which I
Oh
find
yeah.
interesting. You know, I
Well, yeah.
I was talking to a very prominent person in this world, UFO Bigfoot world, who makes documentaries, and he was started talking about Crowley, and I'm like, listen, man, you're going to put this in, right? Like it's going in your next project. He's like, yeah, I've been thinking about it. I'm like, put it in.
Yeah.
Yeah, because in
Yeah.
some strange way it fits.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of funny because I remember when I was in college, I used to have friends that were like, new atheists, that sort of group, and I was like, man, they're the smartest people in the room, and it really sort of was a bummer for me.
Mm.
But I remember years later, I met some occultists, and if you find an occultist who isn't full of themselves, and they do exist, they're out there.
That's true.
Um, uh, they're the best read person in the room, because they've read about the science, and they've read the things that they agree with, and they've read the things that they don't agree with. In my experience, and oftentimes it's like, oh wow, you've actually put in the work to know you've put in the work to understand what consensus reality, what we're told it is, and you've also looked at what others have said it might be and how you can shift it, and you've still wound up at this position that, like, oh, we there are aspects to this that we can change and we can game the system to our advantage. So I think that there's something to that, and I think that all of these topics could benefit from, if not like a literal interpretation of Golden Dawn or Enochian magic, like not necessarily the literalism, but the lessons and some of the observations that have come through those traditions, I think have a lot to teach us about UFOs and about, spirits, obviously, but also, about things like Bigfoot. And it's some of those lessons just haven't been applied like I think they should. So that's encouraging to hear that, that someone is tinkering around with putting Crowley into a Bigfoot
Yeah.
or UFO Bigfoot documentary, because
Yeah.
it's all I can't help but shake the feeling that it's all one big ball of wax.
And I think too, in case he ever hears this, I think too he was planning to put it in there, but
Mhm.
it seemed like it maybe he was toying with the idea. So I wanted to show my support either way.
Mhm.
But anyways, this might be a loose comparison, but we do seem to be going through a like a neo contemporary spiritualist movement right now. Not unlike the one that maybe we had in the American Northeast back in the early 1900s.
Mhm.
Only this one contains aliens and UFOs and that whole
Yeah.
factor.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I was talking with someone again earlier today, and it's, I had just mentioned the whole new atheist movement. Like that seemed like a really prominent force 30 or so years ago, and it's just dead. It's dead now. Like there's not a
Yeah.
lot of life in that movement anymore. And really what that indicates to me is that, I've heard other people say this as well, like the new age kind of won. These ideas of manifestation and laws of attraction and just, your outlook changing your reality, like these are kind of part and parcel for household conversations in America, at least. um and I think that that's part of the backdrop that we're seeing all this unfold against. I think a big part of it too is the fact that this is this is a trickster era. I talk about this in Fourth Wall Phantoms quite a bit, but I had I was doing a panel on UFOs in front of a group at a conference, and I said to them, I said, disclosure is not going to happen in the way that you want it to happen, where somebody's going to step forth and be like, here's what they are and where they're coming from and what their ships represent. And the reason for that is because, and this is a problem that you see all across the world, Think of the person that you didn't vote for in the last election, and now they're president, and they're telling you that UFOs exist. Do you believe them? And the answer is no. Like, so you're always going to have 50% of the population, and that's a trend that you can see globally. There's always going to be 50% of the population that isn't going to believe or that is going to believe, and that's before we even get to whether or not that person is telling the truth. And so it's like this weird post-truth sort of trickster era that I think we're in. And I don't think that we would have seen the sort of shift in openness towards the UFO topic and just by extension, as we mentioned earlier, all these topics, if it wasn't against that backdrop. I think that plays a huge role in this. For good or ill, I don't know. But I do know that, I have people coming up, you know, 10, 15 years ago, I didn't talk about my interest in these topics with people like at church gatherings because I'd like have to explain this weird line that I walk and, a lot of apologies and etc. And now people come up to me at church events and ask me what I think about Chris Bledsoe. And I'm like, what happened? What happened? And I think it is this sort of topsy-turvy, unstable time period. And it's really all trickster stuff. I mean, you talk to people who are trying to dissect what this is, and they're like, oh, things don't make sense and people are lying left and right, and it's a threshold, it's a transitionary time, and the higher brought low and the lower brought high, and it doesn't make any sense. I'm like, these are all trickster archetypes. These are all trickster attributes. It's trickster time. That's what it is. Um,
I agree with that.
and
Very
to
much so.
navigate that, like, I don't know how we're going to navigate that, and
Mhm.
I have my fingers crossed that we make it through it in one piece. But yeah, it just feels like, and I don't think that this whole UFO resurgence would have happened if it wasn't against that canvas.
Mhm. And yeah, you mentioned something about the new age, and the new age seeming to have won, and I agree. If you look at the scales, they're they're heavy on the scales. That new age stuff is, and that stuff came out. If you go back and look at the 1947 contactee movement that sort of emerges around the same time as Kenneth Arnold and Roswell, with George Van Tassel out in the Mojave and all that.
Yep.
That had that stuff. There's an argument to be made that that's New Age came out of that.
Yeah. I mean, it's like it's this it's like a river and tributaries, and the New Age is the river, but the tributaries that fed into it were the contactee stuff and the theosophy stuff and the
Yeah.
spiritualism stuff, all feeding into this thing. Um, and I think that
And
what
how
makes it
many of these leaders, the leaders in these little pockets of these movements, how many of them are being influenced by this trickster element, and maybe being,
right.
the carrot, right? They're following the carrot.
Well, I have a certain degree of love for the New Age because it's so open and free, but on the other hand, it's so open and free that it can be weaponized easily, it can be taken over by things easily, and I mean like taken over by nefarious human actors and probably nefarious things that aren't human, that have a message or an agenda that they want to get across. So yeah, it is sort of a double-edged sword in that regard.
Yeah, I mean, I'll give you the quick version of it because I've told this story probably too many times on here. But when I was right before I started podcasting, I was talking to a good friend of mine back home in North Carolina about starting the podcast, and I was here in Tennessee. And, we knew we were going to kind of cover this kind of phenomena, the fringy stuff. And something happened where he had a UFO sighting while he was on the phone with me. It was like his
Oh
first
wow.
UFO sighting ever. And it got really weird on his end. Like an explosion happened at the same time that they showed up in the sky in his
Holy
neighbor's backyard.
cow.
So
Yeah.
he hung up the phone, and he's
Yeah.
like he's like I'll call you back. So while I'm waiting, I was kind of in my living room while I was talking to him. I went outside and stepped out on my porch, and it was dark out, and I saw a orb that arced over my neighborhood, but perfectly in my field of vision,
Mhm.
and just a clean, bright light. Um, just an orb, right? I didn't see a craft, and it arced over in my field of vision, and it went over the trees across the street, and it started going back down towards the earth. There's another neighborhood over there. So it went out of view. But before, in mid arc, it blinked at me 3 times. This is seconds after I got off the phone with my friend who just
Yeah.
had a UFO sighting. I
Just for
get,
you. It was just for you. Yeah.
yeah. And so I got back on the phone with him. I was like, man, you are not going to believe this. I told him, and we just reveled in it for a while. It was just one of the weirdest things. It was so intentional. But what happened was it plunged me into a UFO obsession. So when I started my podcast officially, my first 8 or 9, maybe even 10 episodes were on the UFO topic. And I wasn't seeing it clearly. It's like that's why when I had Graham Rendell on, he seemed like such a skeptic to me because I was all in on some of the narratives that are out there. And it's just taken me a while, but it took me, I don't know. Eventually I realized, oh, I've been kind of duped a little bit here by this thing, potentially. This trickster maybe got me to keep my podcast like UFO only. I don't know. Is that crazy or what?
No, I mean, no, so yeah, but when I say it's just for you, I didn't mean it was like just in your head or anything. I meant like
No, I agree.
it
Yeah.
was an experience that was tailored for you at that moment, is what it sounds like to me. And that's something that I hear all the time. But, I don't know. I mean, that's a trajectory that I alluded to earlier, is that people come in sort of wide-eyed and they take all this stuff in, they take it all in as fact, and then you get further into it and you're like, well, you become more discerning. And for the record, I'm very skeptical of the Roswell narrative too. And what you sort of have to arrive at is like this position of like, okay, well, my favorite case can have problems with it, but it doesn't mean that the phenomenon itself isn't true, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's orders of magnitude more difficult with the UFO question, because there has been so much the word that I want to use is probably not podcast friendly, but there have been so many shenanigans, so many alphabet agency shenanigans that have happened over the years, and how that topic has become weaponized, I think is not even a matter of debate. So really trying to sort of separate the wheat from the chaff in that regard is tricky. But yeah, I do think that there is something that will pull you in and sort of get its hooks in you, and pull you in a certain direction. And I've talked about this with a lot of different people, and most of the folks I talk about it with seem to agree, is that it helps when you're involved in these topics to have something else that you're interested in.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I mean, for me it is music. Like, I get frustrated with this stuff. I feel like I'm getting in too deep, and I'm like, okay, I'm gonna go like for a couple of days, just if I can. Sometimes I have deadlines to meet and this and that, but like, I'm going to spend my free time like re-immersing myself in music, re-immersing myself in just something else that I'm interested in. Because when you don't have that outlet, I you enter the chapel perilous, and I feel like this thing eats your lunch. Like, it can literally lead you to some like dark places. It can literally lead you to isolated places, and I just think it's not something that should be dwelt upon too long. As your sole focus. The same. It's kind of like those old warnings you might get with occultism. Like, that's one of the reasons. Like, don't get into it. That might be what selling your soul to the devil really is just becoming so obsessed with this thing that you can't extricate yourself from it.
Yeah. Yeah. And what's interesting too is that this disclosure thing, kind of, we find ourselves immersed in this at a time where people's trust for the government is at an all-time low.
Right.
And not just government, the media and the academic institutions.
All the mouthpieces that would tell you aliens are here and you're supposed to believe them, nobody trusts anymore. Yeah. So
What
so if I'm this trickster oriented phenomenon, like, this is the time. Like, this is the time to do whatever we want to. The waters will be forever muddied, even if we can somehow regain our faith in our institutions. Well, yeah, they said that UFOs were real, but that was in that time period where we didn't trust anything. Like, it's ripe for the picking. It really is.
Yeah, yeah. How much of this stuff that we've talked about today have you sort of parsed through in Fourth Wall Phantoms? I know it's not out yet, but I'm assuming it's written.
I mean, a good bit because part of the project was sort of a warehouse for ideas that I'd had over the years, and it was like, oh, they kind of all do speak to this sort of thing about belief and um about weaponization and about how these narratives get mediated. Like that all plays a role. To the extent that you look at things like the UFO topic and that sort of Wright Patterson memo that I mentioned that Whitley talked about. And it's like, well, are even our media is even our media sort of managed in the sense that it helps to help these things either stay behind the veil or come forward through the veil as, our superiors seem to think is best for us. So that's a big part of it. But yeah, it is one of those topics where I ended up engaging finally with like the nature of reality and things like panpsychism and idealism and polypsychism and dual aspect monism and these other things that make my brain hurt. But like that's where you end up because you end up with this in this space of like, well, there are these things. There's this base reality that that I feel relatively comfortable in, and then there are these things that bleed through. And as someone whose tastes have evolved over the years to really fully embrace and even adore high strangeness. Taking a look at these things from the perspective of bleed throughs from the imagination is one of the few ways that you can reconcile some of these absurdities, I think. Um, but because of all that, you do end up engaging with, artistic concepts. Part of a big chunk of the book is applying the uh, the discipline of narratology to the paranormal, but also, I mean, high strangeness is basically just surrealism. Like you look at a checklist of what surrealism, because surreal doesn't just mean bizarre. Like as an artistic movement, it has its own goals and has
Yes.
imagery that comes up time and again. And if you look at like a checklist of those, like they all appear in high strangeness. And I think that this idea of so that seems to be like, so if they have the same attributes, maybe they have the same goal, which, in surrealism was to sort of unmoor a lot of our assumptions and, let us think about this surreal, above above reality, higher reality. So you're looking at that, and you're also looking at, these stories of breaking the fourth wall, these bleed throughs from the world of the fiction into our world. The book starts with, stories of authors interacting with their characters, of which there are a shocking amount. I don't even scratch the surface on how many there are. But that becomes a vehicle for taking a look at like how these phenomena do evolve, like we were talking about earlier. They seem to take a look at what the culture seems to have the most affinity for and be like, oh, that's a great image. I'm going to start using that in my encounters and such. So that's a big part of it. The role that hoaxes seem to play in pulling out genuine phenomena is a part of it too. But again, I keep on returning through the book to this concept of breaking the fourth wall, which is known in narratological circles as metalepsis. Um, and not only an author interacting with the character or the character interacting with the author. I think it ends up being a really powerful concept and has completely sort of reworked the way that I think about the paranormal in general, because metalepsis, breaking the fourth wall, is a transgression of these hierarchical boundaries, right? You've got a character talking to the audience, or the
Mhm.
the, the narrator talking to the character. There's a
Like Deadpool.
yeah, 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 exactly. And it's an acknowledgement of a reality outside your own, sometimes interacting with, a power that has the ability to change your reality. Like it's such a power. It is basically everything we talk about when we talk about the paranormal. And
That's a
not
great title for this, by the way.
thanks,
'Cause,
thanks.
I mean, fourth wall, I'm familiar with that because I did I was involved with a big play at one point,
Mhm,
and it was like a big production. It took us like a couple months, and I had a because I it was 10 Little Indians from Agatha Christie,
mhm.
and because I helped adapt the screenplay or the book into playwright, I got a really big role in it. And so I got kind of immersed in the theater world there for a little bit, and that's how I know about the fourth wall thing
Mhm.
because you're on stage and you're ignoring the audience, but they're
Yeah.
perceiving you. And then you know to break that would be to engage directly with the audience, which in some cases would totally just derail a play. But when you watch Deadpool, it's cool because he looks right at you and he talks to you in the movie.
Right. And what is Deadpool? I mean, Deadpool is a trickster, right? And
Yes.
so you're bringing in this tricks because tricksters violate boundaries. They upend hierarchies, which is sort of what we're talking about when interacting with you're bringing the narrator down to the level of the character or bringing the audience. You're doing all that stuff. So I think that it has a lot to tell us about, or a lot to teach us about the way that we can sort of interact with the paranormal and maybe even become tricksters ourselves. One of the things that really drove it home for me, in terms of this being a useful concept, is that if you look at in on Greek urns and vases, the figures are almost exclusively shown in profile, with a few really important exceptions that are looking at the viewer of the urn, right? And
Mm.
those exceptions are, let me get this right, uh, deities, monsters, sleepers, the dead, and those in altered states of consciousness. And it's like that's a list of the paranormal. Like the ones who are looking beyond the frame of the
Yeah.
artwork, the ones who are acknowledging the person looking at the art, who aren't shown in profile, are deities, monsters, sleepers, the dead, and people in altered states of consciousness. So it seems to be something that we have known for a while. That this is at the very least it's a very potent metaphor for how we can view the paranormal through art, and it might be if you want to get really weird, depending on your own personal assumptions about reality, like maybe life in reality is its own sort of cosmic art project.
Wow. Wow. I'm reminded of this really weird story actually that I think maybe I heard this on Coast to Coast back in the day, but it was you mentioned remote viewing earlier. I think there was a remote viewer on there. And he's talking to Art, and he's going into how he was involved with these government programs, like you mentioned. You know, our tax
Mhm.
dollars did pay for a lot of
Yep.
remote viewing. You know, ops, and they were in a session, the remote viewers were, and they were remote viewing Russia as like a part of like a spy game thing. And they're in this room, they're watching these Russians have a meeting or whatever. And our remote viewer, our US remote viewer, had to be pulled out of the session because she was in there in the astral, I guess, or whatever, and she's, watching this meeting take place, and there's a Russian remote viewer in the meeting who makes eye contact with her. And she's never had this happen, right? This remote viewer has never had a somebody interact with them in that way. I
Looking
can't remember
back,
if they
yeah,
were,
yeah.
yeah, I can't remember if they were a girl or a boy at this point. I'm sorry, but anyway, that happened, and the remote viewer had to be pulled out of the session. I'm like, what? And that's your classic coast to coast AM experience right
Yeah,
there. But
I love that though. Yeah. I
but
love
it's
that.
like,
Well, it puts me in the mindset. There's that famous story of Ingo Swann who is given
yeah.
a set of coordinates, and he sees like this, alien planet, and they have these giant um, buildings, and they're harvesting something, and then like they're these people who are doing the work on this alien surface, and then they turn to look at him, and it's revealed later that like supposedly the coordinates he was given were the dark side of the moon. Um, And look, I don't know if I believe that there are moon people on the other side of the moon doing all that stuff.
Sure.
But the question is, if we entertain that idea that was as reported, like what did he look like? Did he look like himself there? Did he look like a glowing orb,
Mm,
surveying the moon surface? And to that extent, like, I think that leaves the door open to bring into question what these lights in the sky are. Like, are they things from another planet remote viewing Earth? Like, let's have our cake and eat it too. Yes, it's aliens, but it's really weird aliens. So everybody's happy, me and all the extraterrestrial folks too. But yeah, it's so yeah. I hope that with Fourth Wall Phantoms, I hope that like I remain ambivalent on how literally these things should be told, but or treated rather, but like by treating them literally, I feel like I can sort of dial back and be like, okay, like what about this seems to hold true? And that
Well,
whole
you
idea of breaking the fourth wall has proved to be very fruitful. Yeah.
Yeah, wow, it's that's a new frontier for me. Just the whole concept of it. I love it. But you mentioned authors seeing their characters
Oh
come to
yeah.
life.
Oh yeah.
Is that something that maybe you've experienced as an author?
So actually, it's kind of funny. I don't think it works for nonfiction, right? So like, and like
Yeah.
for whatever you think my books are, I'm not, I'm not making up characters and stuff. Like they are nonfiction in that sense, right? With the exception of my novel that I wrote and released in 2023. And part of it was so that I could see if I could sort of have those experiences. It was kind of like a mini ritual. Because I'd had friends who were like, sort of real straight-laced kind of like atheist authors who were like, yeah, I'm like, if you have a really well-written character, they won't let you do this or that. And I'm like, do you hear what you're saying? Like, do you hear what you're saying? So I was like, okay, well, let's see if I can have that experience. And I got it a couple of times. By far the most well, there are two things that really stand out from that experience of writing that book. The first one was that I would ponder over an issue all day trying to figure out some sort of plot point, and it would almost always like come to me on the cusp of sleep, which was a real pain in the ass because like I'm trying to fall asleep, and now I've got to, if I don't write it down, I'm not going to retain this in the morning. So that was weird because it would be like, oh no, this is totally obvious. This is totally what it should be. Done. But I did have a moment uh, where there's a character who works at a pharmacy, and I was at my pharmacy and I saw someone who very closely fit that character, and I never saw her before, and only until recently have I seen her at the pharmacy. So I'm kind of disappointed. I mean, I'm not disappointed that she's
Mhm.
alive because she's a human
Sure.
being and I'm glad she's alive, but I was kind of like, oh, okay, well, you are a real person. But it was very strange to see someone that very closely matched the description of that character sort of show up with my pills at the door of the pharmacy.
Hmm.
So yeah.
Well, yeah, what were the and I mean, I know you have a book and I want people to go out and buy the book, so we don't want to give up everything. But
Right.
how many stories like that did you come across? And were they predominantly, I guess they were fictional
I mean,
writers?
yeah, so I strongly recommend that in addition to Fourth Wall Phantoms, people pick up this book called Embodied Imaginations by Chidambaram Ramesh.
Cool.
This is more or less a catalog of those. So you can
Mm.
see why I didn't get all of those into my book because it's like,
Ah,
well, I don't want to
I,
just, repeat all that wholesale.
wow,
Um,
I didn't realize there were so many.
how many? I mean, like, one of the early Superman writers met Superman. Grant Morrison claimed to have met Superman. Alan Moore ran into John Constantine several times. Other people who have worked on John Constantine ran into him several times. A close friend of mine who was working on a fanfic about Constantine ran into Constantine, and that's in the book. Um,
You know
Alice
that's
Walker had some of her
sorry.
characters come up from Color Purple. I'm sorry, just a ton of different
Yeah.
people. Yeah.
No, I just want to say something about the Constantine thing because that's interesting. He comes up in weird places on my show too sometimes, but like I have a shelf over there full of Alan Moore,
Mhm.
and I don't know much about John Constantine actually. I don't think I have a comic book with him in it. I think he showed up because I looked it up one time. I think he showed up in Swamp Thing, and then it did it turn into the movie with Keanu Reeves? Is that sort
It's
of
the same character, although people were like, "This is not like Constantine," and sure
okay?
enough, like it's not like Constantine at all.
Okay.
But yeah, it was based on that character, Hellblazer. Um, yeah, Rudyard Kipling had some people with that, some interactions like that. Oh geez, Heinrich Ibsen, who was writing A Doll's House, had Nora come up and touch him on the shoulder. Dickens used to talk about his characters as like he would avoid his characters out on the street. Like just some wild. And again, that's the weird thing is that you're like, okay, I'm going to read through this and it's going to be a bunch of kooks. And it's not. It's people that we celebrate who have had this exact same thing happen. Um, and there was even University of Durham, I believe it was, over in the UK, conducted a survey on two separate years at the Edinburgh Book Festival, And even amongst those authors, they had varying degrees of interaction with their characters. And Ramesh goes through a lot of this, but there's like the sense that they're sort of talking in your head and arguing, and that could be written off as, just your imagination, really having those well-developed characters. But then, smaller, ever smaller, but still quite substantial subsets of people, I can't remember the percentages, but would explain, hearing their characters' voices like audibly, seeing their characters walking past the doorway, and in some instances, like the character comes over and plops down and has a conversation with them. So again, if you know anything about me, you know that like I try to live in this zone of like I don't know, I don't know. But the fact that it comes from so many people is really interesting to me, and equally interesting are the fact that people who aren't quote unquote creative types also interact with characters that seem very fictional. Um, so it's not like these dreamy artist types who are kind of sniffing their own farts who are the only ones talking about meeting their characters, right? It's like, everyday working people too. And there was a time in ufology when, using ufology specifically, but all these topics, these subjects, there was a time when you'd be like, okay, well, this person's crazy because they say that they saw Aquaman, right? But if we treat the stories of those authors seriously, then maybe we should treat these other stories seriously too. And again, I'm not necessarily advocating for that, but I'm saying that we should at least, listen to them, right? Because these trends change across ufology. At one point, it was considered, you were full of it if you were a repeat experiencer, and that's obviously changed quite dramatically. Like people look for you being a repeat experiencer now. So who knows? Maybe at some point, more credit will be given to these sort of stranger stories about people seeing fictional characters and whatnot. Um, but I just if you look, even if you look at things that are non-specific, the fictions just bleed into all this stuff. I mean, um this is the work of people like Bertrand Mayust, who found strong correlations between early 20th century pulp magazines and their depictions of visitors from other planets and the post Arnold UFO era. He was like very close correlations. So again, tying in with our conversation about these craft evolving over time, it's not a technological advancement, it's somehow tapping into what our culture expects to see. Um, you know, that seems to be what's going on. And what happens when you take that, this sort of thing has been applied to the UFOs for a while, but you know me, like I can't just talk about one topic. So so like I apply it to the ghost stuff and I apply it to the cryptid stuff. And there is a shocking, this is the one thing where I am going to play coy. There is a shocking correlation that I think I've made between Bigfoot and one of my favorite franchises. And once I started looking at it, I kept on finding similarities, and I have to be like, oh, it seems like there's some sort of connection here between these two. And I haven't seen it mentioned anywhere to my knowledge. So
Oh, is
I'm
there going to be
excited.
a reveal for that in a perhaps in a book?
Yeah, no, that's in the book. That's in the
Oh, it's
book.
in there. Okay,
It's
okay,
in the
great.
book. Yeah, yeah. Sort of applying this, like seeing how the Bigfoot phenomena might be picking bits and pieces from our media in these stories and in these encounters.
Is this art, what's the phrase? Art imitates life. Is that because you can flip it
Yeah.
around, but this is
Well,
almost like maybe, and I don't
that's
attribute everything to egregores and tulpas and all that. That's an interesting concept, but is this something along the lines of that where it's like, how much of this are we creating?
that's a
I
that's a, that's a great question, and it's something that I try to sort of engage with a little bit because I have this sense after looking at it that every time you find an encounter, you will find an artistic antecedent. And then if you look back in the history of the phenomenon, you'll find another account that has that. And then you'll find another piece. And it's just like this game of leapfrog as far back as you can go. So where do you draw the line, right? Do you draw the line at myths and legends? Do you draw the line at, petroglyphs? You can't get art much older than that.
Mhm.
So I don't know. I do think that there seems to be some sort of cyclicality to it, and that's where I'll probably sort of leave it. Much in the same way that some religious scholars see there being sort of a cyclicality between genuine mystical experiences and the literature that sort of wells up around it.
Yeah. I got really into John Keel. I still appreciate his work, but I'm not like actively reading it currently. But anyway, there was a time where I just really dove into it. And I even went back and I found like an obscure website that has some guy who knew him put this website up, and he has all these cool, like, he has a collection of John Keel's letters to not only like magazines and newspapers, but to his friends. And there's a bit of a timeline there. It's when you look closely because everything's dated, right?
Mhm.
And you can kind of go through. And I was trying to go through and see what Keel was up to while he was, engaged with the Mothman case. And then I went back and I was like, oh, let me go back further while the Mothman case was happening, but he wasn't on the case yet.
Mhm.
Let me see what was going on. And he was, now I couldn't pinpoint the exact date, but he was going from, he had been down in Georgia and he was going up through South Carolina and he made a stop there and investigated a case. And then he went up, uh, presumably through West Virginia around the time that this happened. And I just thought to myself, well, that's interesting. How much of this is happening because there is a person out there dedicated looking for this kind of stuff to happen?
Right.
And
Like,
I would
yeah,
never
yeah.
say that Mothman happened because John Keel was out on the same highway,
Right.
but
Yeah. How many
but
people? How many people had to die for John Keel? Yeah, that's the real that's the real pressing question. No, but
mm,
I see what you mean. It's like, hey, he's going to be coming this way. We might as well do something. I mean, yeah, that's an interesting idea, and that's something that I think Keel would probably resonate with to a certain degree because he was this idea of metalepsis of breaking the fourth wall, as I see it most often manifesting in the paranormal, is this old chestnut that you've probably heard of, like, you look at the phenomenon and the phenomenon looks back. That reflective phenomena is what Keel called it. And that seems to be what was happening with Keel. So like the idea that he was looking for something and he found it would definitely sort of dovetail with that,
mhm.
you know.
Yeah,
Um
he had something on him, kind of like Crowley, but not as dark, where it was like he had like he affected his surroundings and he had a gravitational pull almost to the subject itself.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting too. I mean, Keel was wrote some scripts for Lost in Space. Like he was dabbling in like full on creative waters too.
Yes.
He
Yeah.
wasn't just, and some would argue that his books are even more creative than than they're presented
Right,
as.
right.
But again, that's sort of part of what I wanted to sort of reconcile in this new book for me was um how I've just kind of gotten to the point in a lot of cases where I don't care about how true Keel was being, and I know that really will get the dander up on some people. But uh, I again, something that well, how do I put this? In my books, I will never like say I will never fudge the facts and present something as true when it's not. But for me personally, it's almost like we are dealing in this sort of modern sort of myth making, and very few people would come to you and say that myths are literally true, but they're always sort of figuratively true. So for me personally, like the absolute veracity of what Keel was experiencing or documenting. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. And I don't have to know. I just have to know that it's become a part of, you know, the American landscape, and certainly the paranormal landscape and the landscape of the world. And I think that that has some sort of objective power to it as well, regardless of whether or not things went down just as he said that they went down. And that's sort of where I've landed with a lot of that.
Yeah, and where there's smoke, there's fire, they say. And there was a lot of smoke with that. There's a lot of people alive today who still maintain their stories, and
Mhm.
it does seem like something happened in Point Pleasant. It does seem
Yeah,
like
no,
something happened there. And I know what
yeah.
you're saying. I'm not trying to like go to bat for Keel here because
No,
yes,
no, no, no. I mean, and again, like if you know anything about me, like I'm as long as you're suitably ambivalent, I'm gonna be suitably ambivalent, right? Like it's like I don't know, I wasn't there.
sure.
But I've look, West Virginia is just a really odd place in terms of
I noticed
activity in
your
general.
shirt.
Oh yeah, I got my my
Yeah, yeah. Little
flatwoods
flatwoods. I have a
hoodie.
little one right here,
Oh,
actually, with
nice,
flatwoods.
nice. Um, and I think um, a beautiful place. I got the chance to finally like really go there and not just pass through a couple of years ago. And like I don't know, like walking through the streets of Point Pleasant, it was so affecting for me because it was always a real place, but like it had lived in my head for so long that it was just weird to walk through that town and to get a sense for the sense of place and everything.
Mm.
And like in that sense, it was like walking through, Oz or Westeros or Middle Earth or something, and kind of left me with a little bit of this, Jerusalem syndrome that people get when they go to the Holy Land. I was like, oh, this is weird, I feel like well, I felt like I was stepping into a story.
Sure.
Um, and I don't know, but I would say that I do think that there's plenty of strange stuff in a lot of different places, but West Virginia as well. And I've kind of wondered why that might be. And I look at a lot of those communities in West Virginia that are still living relatively isolated. There are places where, electricity isn't super reliable. The internet sure as heck isn't reliable. Um, so there's, a little bit more of an isolation. Oftentimes they're living near members of near family members. I mean, it sort of harkens back to the way we as a species used to live. And I wonder if what comes with that is a closer connection to the land and to um, basically the reality that we all knew before this sudden surge of technology that we become obsessed with. And if that doesn't necessarily lend itself to being more fertile ground for all sorts of paranormal phenomena to well up, I don't know.
Oh yeah, wow, that's a great point. I grew up a good part of my years growing up were spent in Appalachia,
Mhm.
and a lot of the older people in the community still believed in fairies. And very much so. I mean, it even goes back to this powwow book. Like a
Mhm.
lot of that, I guess, Pennsylvania Dutch folk magic stuff had kind of somehow, it's almost like it filtered its way down through Appalachia and made its way into North Carolina, or who knows how it got there. But a lot of people still held those beliefs, and part of those beliefs were, rituals or little things that you could do to keep the fairies at bay.
Mhm.
And but I think, harkening back to what you said there, I think what you have here is you have a very remote community where some of this stuff is lingering from the old world, and people are just naturally closer to the earth out there.
Mhm.
There's no what do they call it, like there's not a lot of lights out there, light pollution. There's no light pollution.
I
There's
mean,
you
and to
know
this day, it's still a culture dependent largely on self-reliance. I mean,
yes, good
you
point.
got to chop your wood. You gotta you gotta go
Yeah.
get these things. You do these things yourself. Yeah, a lot of my on my mom's side, my family comes from the Appalachian Mountains in North Carolina,
Mm.
and yeah, it's kind of funny because as this tide is starting to change, and Morgan Daimler is releasing a book soon that should dispel some of these myths, I hope. But for the longest time, among fairy scholars, they'd say, "Oh, well, fairy belief didn't really make the journey from Europe over to the US. They were indigenous fairy beliefs, but in terms of the European beliefs coming over here and taking root, didn't really take root much outside of like New England." And the more I've looked into it, the more I just think that's patently false. I mean, stories of Tommy knockers and mount and in mining in mines in Montana, and stories of fairy abduction in Davenport, Iowa, and then again, as you alluded to, that sort of rich tradition in Appalachia, which is clearly, at least in some regards, a handing down of those traditions from places like Scotland, because it's where a lot of Scottish people ended up settling. Um, said the guy named Cutchin, right? Um, but but also, the way that those beliefs syncretized with the indigenous beliefs in the area. And
Right, the Cherokee.
yeah, and yeah, yeah, and I can't help but imagine that some of those Cherokee beliefs, if they were as presented in some of the older ethnographies, if they didn't just fit into those Scottish beliefs like hand and glove. I mean, like some of these Cherokee beliefs just sound like they're straight out of the UK, like they really do in Ireland. I mean, it's just time dilation, association with mounds, like all these things that you'll find later, or not later, but
Wow.
you'll find in those. European texts were apparently believed by the Cherokee, depending upon their certain different types of fairies that they believed in.
Wow, yeah, that's so true. Yeah. And I don't see that highlighted a lot. Even with people who kind of spend a lot of time going back to the old native folklore and, making an exegesis on that in some type of way, whether it's a YouTube video or a book. I don't necessarily see them talking about the Cherokee fairy stuff, and I
And
find that stuff
it's
fascinating.
so rich. I mean, there's only so much that I can do as someone who is not Cherokee and who does not speak that language. So I have to sort of, there's some sources that you can rely on that are from the past, and I have a small book written by someone who is from the Cherokee Nation. And some of that definitely comports with these European beliefs in an odd way. There's a book by I believe it's James Mooney about beliefs and myths and legends of the Cherokee, and I have to say in that book I can only see one of two things being true. The first is that James Mooney just grafted a lot of, British fairy belief onto the Cherokee. Cultural contamination, right? Or people on both sides of the Atlantic were interacting with the same thing, because some of these things are so specific. I mean, and you don't really, it's kind of odd because you don't really see a strong association between fairies and earthworks outside of like the southeastern US. But you do find like there's a very prominent mound that still exists in Franklin, North Carolina, called the Niquosi Mound, and it was in one of the stories that was retold often. The Cherokee were they were under threat from another tribe, and the Nunyanahi, one of their variations on fairies, poured out of the mound to defend the Cherokee people. And it's like, well, that's you could put that same story anywhere, in Western Europe, and it would fit just as well. So yeah, it's really fascinating stuff. And
Yeah, I
just
have that
yeah.
James Mooney book. Yeah, it's
Okay,
it's
yeah, yeah.
great. Myths of the Cherokee, and like even it's rich. Those some of those stories in
Mhm.
there are very rich. Even the one dealing with the Moon-Eyed people is,
Yeah.
I think if I remember correctly, I think in his retelling of that, and I'd like to think that he went straight to the source there and I think he was hanging out with a lot of tribe members and getting some of this stuff. But they said that the Moon-Eyed people, I think, actually had black eyes
Mhm.
like you would
Yeah.
expect from a nocturnal animal.
Yeah, and that's what's sort of frustrating, because like, a lot of people will look at the Moon-Eyed people and they'll want to force it into this Prince Madoc legend about
Yeah.
the Welsh coming over and interbreeding, and like, I don't know. But when I read those stories and I hear, about the structures that were attributed to the Moon-Eyed people, it reads like fairy stuff. Like it really does. Like,
Mhm.
large black eyes prefer to come out under cover of darkness. And again, associated with, in this case, an ancient monument, this wall that is still on Fort Mountain, Georgia, just up the road from here, was supposedly in some traditions built by the Moon-Eyed people. So again, it's the exact same thing you'd find with involving a fort or a stone circle in the UK. So yeah, I always find that interesting. I also find it interesting how much the internet is able to wring out of just a fairly small passage in the Mooney book. They'll do an entire like 45-minute video on the Moon-Eyed people, and I'm like, where are you getting this from?
I know. It's yeah. I find that there's a combination of retellings but kind of merged into one a lot of times. So you
Right.
tack on this version and that version, and now you've got a yeah, now you've got a 45-minute video. But I've got to ask, and we can maybe wind down with this. Did anything did you experience anything writing this book, or beyond that, have you had any supernatural experiences yourself?
Well, I don't really know if I experienced anything related to Fourth Wall Phantoms while writing Fourth Wall Phantoms. Um, Fourth Wall Phantoms might be a giant ritual, though, so I'll let everybody read it and and figure it out. I have my motivations, so there might be something to that. As far as my own personal experiences, I have to. I don't know. Maybe you've experienced this. I have to write them down, because if I don't, they just one
Mhm.
of two things happens. Either I will forget about them, which is, super common in this realm, people forgetting about these really impressive events, or the further I get from them, they have sort of a half-life where it's like you start to become more skeptical about what you saw.
Yes.
As the years go by, you're like, well, maybe it was this, maybe it was that. You've got to like really remember and put yourself back in that moment. So, most of what I've experienced have been sort of the ghost variety. One of the most, two of the most dramatic where I saw, um, a Civil War, what I believe was the ghost of a Civil War soldier, maybe 14 or so years old, in a house that was used for a hospital during the Civil War. He was standing in a group of people, and I asked everybody else that was around me after the fact, like, "What do you think of that? That guy was into cosplaying, huh?" And like, nobody else had seen him, so I guess that's what that was. The one that's really hard for me to deny is that I had a heavy metal door at Waverly Hills Sanitarium slam open in my face, so like 3 feet from it, and it goes from completely shut to bam, like open, hitting the wall behind it.
Mm.
That's a hard one to explain away. Um, Bigfoot adjacent stuff. I was out with Tim at Site 7 the first time, and something huffed at us and walked away on what sounded like were 2 feet. It didn't sound like a whitetail, but who knows? I was out on a Bigfoot overnight in North Georgia across like 15 minutes into private land in the backside of the Chattahoochee National Forest and heard a car door slam, which was odd. Very
Mm.
John Keel though, right? Babies crying and car doors slamming were the two symptoms of monster sightings, he said.
And missing
It was
411.
and miss, yeah, yeah. So it's like, okay, that's a little bit eerie. And someone else with me heard it too. I was like, "Did you hear?" And they said a car door slam. So I was like, "Okay, well, it wasn't just me, right?" Um, so that was interesting. And then there's the Bigfoot hot tub honeymoon, which is probably one of my best Bigfoot stories. So not coincidentally, same area, Blue Ridge, Georgia, was where we did where we had our quick little honeymoon. We later, several years later, went to Ireland, which is kind of like the big honeymoon, but this was just a little overnight that we did right after we were married. And the last night that we were there, I was drunk and being a fool in a hot tub that overlooked the valley, and I was, at the time I was not as involved as I am. This would have been 2013. And so I was, hooping and hollering and doing Bigfoot yells and just being dumb. So the next day, wake up and my wife starts moving some stuff out to the car to go home, and she comes back in. She goes, "Why did you do that?" I said, "Why did I do what?" And she said, "The Rock." I'm like, I have no idea what you're talking about. We're like like 5 days into this marriage and we're already having communication issues, right? And she's like, "You're kidding me, right?" And she takes me back there, and I used to have a picture of it somewhere. I don't know what I did with it, but there was a rock that was maybe like basketball sized that was behind the wheel, the rear driver's side wheel of the car. And I know that's not that impressive, but I didn't drive over the thing. Like, I didn't drive over the thing. I didn't put it there. She didn't put it there. There was a wall, maybe, I don't know, 30 to 50 feet a side of the mountain over there, all red Georgia clay. This rock wasn't in red Georgia clay at all. Nowhere else that it could have come from. And the driveway to this particular cabin was like super steep. So I wouldn't have gone up there I wouldn't have I wouldn't have put that much exertion in for a prank.
Sure.
And if I was going to prank somebody, like I would have put it on like the top of my car or the hood of my car. So like it was just this giant rock that showed up behind the tire of my car the night after hooping and hollering trying to call in Bigfoot. So
That was
it
what did you tell me earlier? That was for you. That was tailored for you.
was for me, yeah. It was for me, and again, Blue Ridge is like a Bigfoot hotspot. I mean, it's there's a Bigfoot museum up there that's quite good, uh, but it's that part of Georgia is just a Bigfoot hotspot. So yeah, I mean, it was for me because again, being uh having not being as immersed in this stuff as I am now, it was kind of like a little wink that like, hey, maybe there's more to this stuff than you think there is, Even though I would have my heart would have told you that there was a Bigfoot, but my head would not have, if that makes any sense.
It does make
And
sense.
and after that, I was like, okay, yeah, there's something to this.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, especially that region. I mean, it's just that town or the area of Appalachia I was talking about earlier, where a lot of the older people in the community had the fairy beliefs and stuff like that. Bigfoot was a big part of that community.
Mhm.
However, it wasn't big in the way you might think. There weren't statues of Bigfoot, and there weren't people throwing, expos or Bigfoot festivals every year. These people kept it quiet, but it was still there. They believed in it. It was big in the local belief system. Of course, they called them wood boogers.
Yeah, boogers. Yep.
And, if you or I would walk up and ask somebody about it, they probably wouldn't talk about it. But after
Yeah.
you've lived in the community for a while, you realize, oh, there's an essence here of this thing.
Yeah.
And, there's, I could go on for a long time telling strange stories that happened to me or to my friends or to my girlfriend from that area. But even in recent years, during the lockdown, I went to Lake Junaluska
Hmm.
in North Carolina, and I was sitting out watching the sun go down, kind of looking out over the lake, and I heard distant screams, weird screams, the
Hmm.
kind that you hear on a Bigfoot podcast or
Yeah.
Bigfoot documentary, where it's like there's something unnatural about it. It's like it's you can tell it's coming from a bigger thing
Yeah.
almost, right?
Yeah.
So it's there. It's in that region. Something is.
Yeah, I'm convinced of it. And my good friend David Metcalf pointed out this is one of my favorite ideas that he's ever pointed out. This is in Footprints. Um, the Bigfoot Museum was put up in Blue Ridge because it was a Bigfoot hotspot. But even the owner, David Becara, has told me, he's like, I knew it was a hotspot, but I didn't know it was this big because now people, come there and they share their stories. And my friend David Metcalf was like, it's almost like he built a Bigfoot temple, right? And it's
Right.
like, it attracts followers. It has sacred objects. People leave offerings of a sort, in the form of their hard-earned cash. Um, and it sort of boosts the, to use that term that egregore of Bigfoot. It sort of has all those hallmarks. So yeah, um,
Well, I've noticed you haven't used the word quantum yet. What's going
right.
on?
Well, it's kind of funny. I talk to people about fourth wall phantoms, and they say, "Oh, so it's a book about tulpas." I'm like, no, I have to talk about tulpas because of the subject matter, but a couple of things about the tulpa concept have never really sat well with me. This didn't make it into the book, but I did speak to a researcher one time. Didn't make it into the book because it was from a friend of a friend, but I did speak to a researcher one time who claimed that they had a friend who had a private meeting with a really high placed lama. And among the things that they wanted to ask was, you know, can you tell me more about tulpas? Because they were really into all this stuff. And, so they're sitting there with the translator and it's going back and forth. And finally, this person works up the courage to say, can you tell me more about tulpas? It translates it to the Lama, and the Lama looks at what was basically the reaction. So, I'm not sure how much of the whole Tulpa idea isn't like theosophy adjacent kind of wishful thinking. But that doesn't mean that things like that don't exist, if that makes any sense. So, yeah, I addressed Tulpas a little bit, but and egregores obviously too. But I think that a lot of what we're dealing with in this capacity is perhaps even more mysterious and miraculous than that.
Hmm.
So that's where I guess maybe I'll leave it.
The the case that comes to mind for me is Slender Man.
Hmm.
And it's interesting because in my research, I came across this old native legend about what's called the Nalusa Philea. I found
Hmm.
several accounts of it from the late 1800s.
Nolocephalea.
Maybe you're saying it correct.
Oh no, I'm
Nalusa Philea.
Nolucephalea. Oh, I was thinking cephaly, like head oriented. Okay.
Yeah, it's
Okay. Nolucephalea.
Nalusa,
Okay.
Nalusa. But it's the more I looked into it, the more I realized it has all these striking comparisons to Slender Man. Of course, this is before the technology age. There's no computers around, but it's tall, slender. It's a shadow. It stalks people, and it likes to live in like the densest part of the woods, but if it comes out, it wants to get you or stalk you and drag you back in. And
Mm-hmm.
um, there's I even came across a case about a farmer who said his chickens were being stolen, and he went out to confront the thing, and it looked around from behind a tree at him, and it mimicked his face. It was somehow able to show his face back to him, but with the add-on of a maniacal smile. So other than that, it's typically just uh, referenced as a big lanky shadow. And then you have the Slender Man case, and it's like, going back to this conversation we had about AI and technology, is that something older that has somehow managed to interact with us now through through the internet or through Wi-Fi or through the computer somehow.
Well, it's a lot like the black-eyed kids, right? Because like I think that those clearly began on the internet, but they were tapping into these older ideas and, dare I say, sort of older archetypes about, vampires needing to be let in and stuff like that.
Mm,
So I can totally see there being sort of like a place for these sort of new quote unquote inventions being related to older ideas and such. Um, I've got to look into that a little bit more because like it takes a lot to give me the willies, but that gave me the damn willies, man. That's like I'm just imagine that scenario, right?
yeah.
You go out into the woods and like because something's missing and this tall thing peeks out from a tree like 8 feet off the ground and it's
Mhm.
grinning at you with your
Mhm.
face. Good Lord.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
And
yeah.
I came across that late at night, of course. So it
Yeah, I
scared
mean,
me.
yeah. So Slender Man's in the book a little bit. I kind of didn't want to tread familiar ground because people have talked so much about Slender Man.
Mm,
But again, it's a good example of the kind of things that I like to pursue. There are two things that I like to pursue whenever I write a new book, and it's either A, something that people have discussed and uh or have mentioned but haven't really done a deep dive into. Like that's the case with like Trojan Feast and Brimstone Deceit. Um, or it's something that um I don't know what to do with. You know what I mean?
right.
So like Slender Man is like I don't know what to do with this. Like there's a guy who said he made it on the internet and people claim that they're interacting with it. Similarly, like these stories about fictional characters stepping off the page, like I don't know what to do with that. And that to me usually means, okay, Josh, that's what you're gonna talk about because you've got to find a way. For me, I had to find a way to make it work.
Mhm.
And every part of my rational self says, nope, this doesn't make any sense. It's a bunch of BS. But I think there are ways to make it work. And again, I don't want to stay there for long because it makes reality look real topsy turvy in a way that I can't handle. But I definitely feel richer, um, in terms of my perspective for having gone onto that deep dive. So,
Yeah, and you
yeah.
you asked earlier, I think, you were talking about writing down your experiences, and to your question, yes, I do that as well. When I started the podcast, because I had this big weird orb sighting or whatever that was, I decided I was going to start a sighting log. So I've actually managed that, kept up with it. I've kept that going now for, a little over probably almost 2 years now. But and it helps me to sort of remember it correctly,
Mm,
like to keep myself in check. That way, over time, I'm not adding something to the story,
right.
because I can go back and reference that. But that is an interesting thing to do because it's not just big, monumental, life-changing stuff that I write in there. And I don't write in there every day, every week, or even every month. It's just when something weird happens. And I mean, like even recently, I was researching the goddess Ishtar.
Hmm.
I was researching her possible involvement in the modern UFO movement or phenomena. And I had just figured some stuff out. I had just realized that, you know, between straight up occultists and even Bible scholars, many of them agree that she's also the goddess Babylon, who's mentioned in the book of Revelation. So she goes by Babylon. So it ties her in with the Babylon working and all this other stuff. But I had just found that out. And I was feeling a little cramped in the house. So I got out. I went for a little run. And I just happened to go through my playlist, and for for some reason I had heard a POD song the night before when I was running, and I'm like, man, that really got me through this workout. So I'm looking for POD, right? So I pull up a new POD album that I've never heard before, and my phone, instead of playing track one, jumps down to like track seven or something, way out of order, and plays this song called Babylon is a Murderer.
Yep.
And I had to laugh to myself, right? I'm like, I guess I got to write this down because that's a weird synchronicity.
Well, we're talking about this, and that's what I was just doing right now. Is because I was like, I remembered something that I had happened to me, and I was like, surely that's in my list, and no, it wasn't. Yeah, I don't know what it is, but it makes you believe so much more when you have these things slip away from you. It makes you believe so much more of these stories of people being like, yeah, I didn't think about it until years later when somebody mentioned Bigfoot at a party, and it's like, no, I totally get that. And what else does that? Dreams do that. Trips do that. They evaporate. My best ideas do that, right? Unless I write down my best ideas, they evaporate, and sometimes they never come back to me. Um, unless my memory is jogged. So yeah, I think that there's something to it. But yeah, those little synchronicities are just pretty wild. Actually, you're reminding me of this too. Is this on there? Let's see here. Um, I don't think that's on in there either. Okay, there was another one that I had. Yeah, thank you for. I don't know. Oh, there we go. There we go. The ticket. Yeah. Okay. Sorry.
No.
I'm doing housekeeping while I'm on the podcast with you. But yeah, I had a girlfriend. Um, and the relationship was about to end. It wasn't working out. It wasn't like anybody was. It just wasn't. It just between timing and our priorities, it just wasn't going well. And I was coming back from a gig in Texas, and um, she was an oboe player who had gone to the Cincinnati Conservatory of Music. First name Whitney for the purposes of our discussion. Last name um trying to think of a good fake last name to put in here.
Jones.
No, well, no, because it was like two first names, right? So it was like,
Okay.
let's say Whitney Jessica, even though that's not.
Ah.
It sounds like a porn star, but it's not. Anyway, Cincinnati Conservatory of Music oboe player Whitney Jones, right? And and I'm really upset about this. Really, like just torn up about it. I'm on the plane going back, and I'm filling out my crossword puzzle, and the answer for one of the solution as soon as I open up the crossword puzzle is oboe. Okay, whatever.
Hmm.
Within seconds, a ticket falls from the seat in front of me and like lands, underneath the seat by my feet. I pick it up, and the final destination is Cincinnati. Within 10 seconds of this, a guy turns around and like says, "Hey, would you mind giving me my ticket? Sorry, I dropped that." And he has two sleeves of the names of his daughters, Whitney and Jones. Like it was yeah. So oboe, Cincinnati, Whitney and Jones, all within like a 3 minute time period. Um, and it was like, oh, that's really weird. Like that's like one of the most profound synchron. It's the layering and and how quickly it happened that really sort of blew my mind. So yeah,
Timing too.
yeah, and that like my thoughts were about our relationship. Like,
Yeah.
what in the world? And that's one of
Yeah.
those. That's one of those that like I'm glad I did have it written down in my in my experience file, but it's one of those that like I really have to go back and revisit and be like, no, not no, no. Like nobody would,
Yeah.
no author would ever write that and expect someone to believe it. Like but
Yeah.
yeah, these
I
things
know.
happen.
Yeah, it makes you question the nature of reality. And, this could open up a whole side plot into simulation theory and all that. But, another one came to mind. This isn't in my sighting log. This happened to me years ago, but it always stuck with me because of how profoundly weird it was. I was driving to a friend's house through the country, and I think it was dark out or almost about to be dark. But anyway, I see these two deer looking like they're about to cross the street. And I'm like, okay, I'm going to pay attention to this. I'm going to slow down. I don't want them to jump out right in front of me. And I get up a little bit closer, and I've got the radio on, and it's like a talk radio. And the two deer jump and cross the road, but they jump at the exact time, like strangely in unison. And it was so fast
Yeah.
and so perfectly succinct that I remember it shocked me. And I said verbally, I said simultaneously. I don't know why I said that, but it just came out. And as I said simultaneously, the guy on the
The
radio
radio
said
said
simultaneously.
simultaneously. That's wild.
He said it in sync with me. And I was like, what
Yeah.
just happened here?
Yeah.
What
And I
just
think, yeah.
happened?
Yeah, and like, I discuss simulation theory in the new book. I have my own sort of objections to it, but I think that at its heart, like the idea that things are orchestrated and things are not as they seem is something that I can get behind. And I think that a lot more people have stories like that than even they sometimes realize, as we've been discussing.
Oh, the glitch in the Matrix Reddit is, well, I've kind of backed off of Reddit because it's been so infiltrated by the three letters agencies and all
Right.
that. In my opinion, I think that there's a lot of disinformation on there these days, or just weird agendas. But
I had a friend recently say on another show that the most traffic on Reddit comes from some town, and like the only thing in that town is like um an Air Force base or
of
something. So
course,
like I wouldn't
yeah,
doubt it. I wouldn't doubt it.
yeah, and that's the vibe you get on there. Well, if you're, that's the vibe I've gotten, so I backed off. But anyway, I really liked that glitch in the Matrix Reddit because I think it started out somewhat pure where people were really getting on there and being genuine. Some of the stories just have that ring to them that just kind of resound true. And there, you don't get a bunch of red flags and stuff like that. But, I think unfortunately, like most of our social media platforms, that one has probably been compromised at this point. But at one point, that glitch in the Matrix Reddit was on fire, and you were hearing some of the strangest things that are so weird. You question whether or not you question how someone could make that up.
Right.
And I don't know, like, what do you think about that? What do you think about that glitch in the Matrix stuff? Does that, that's my last question. But I am curious, like, how does that ever like find its way into your work?
Yeah, well, what I would say, um, and this is probably a good parting shot to leave
Yeah.
on, um, is that so there's no way to say it without sounding like I'm sort of like bragging or putting on airs here, but like I want to bring back the truly Fortean perspective, by which I mean Charles Fort would collect a story of a cat walking through a crowd on a street, and the cat would say, "Good evening, gentlemen," and move along its way. And Fort didn't try to explain it. He didn't try to like shove it into a
Hmm.
theory or a hypothesis or anything. He would just be like, "This is one of those damned facts," that he would always, you know, as he loved to call it. And I think that a lot of these areas that we engage with could benefit from that sort of like open-minded, detached interest and agnosticism that Fort sort of embodied. And I'm not calling anybody out for trying to put stuff into a theory, because like at the end of the day, like that's a lot of what I do, right? Like let's try to make all this stuff work together. But something that is sort of a referring refrain in Fourth Wall Phantoms is I just say these things just happen. And I don't know what to make of it, but it just seems like certain things just happen, and I don't know what to make of them, and it's fine and good and probably even important to try to fit them into something, but at the end of the day, you just kind of got to throw up your hands and be like, impossible things happen, and I think that's where I've kind of arrived with some of this stuff.
Perfect. We can leave it at that. I've really enjoyed this conversation. Looking forward to the book. I think this book has a lot to offer. I really do. A lot of the people we've spoken about today, Keel, Fort, uh, and many others, I think, have, laid building blocks, sort of paved a way for where we're at today, for and where we find ourselves, whether we like it or not, in this disclosure swirl of the paranormal. So I think your book is right on time. And so I'm looking forward to it, especially after talking to you. I think people realize that, yeah, this is a book for now, you
Yeah,
know? So
that's the sense that I've gotten ever since it is like this is a book to be written in Trickster time, right? It's Trickster
absolutely.
time. Yeah.
So thanks for coming on. Tell everyone where they can find all your stuff.
Well, this was a ton of fun, so thanks for having me on. You can find out all about me at joshuacutchin.com. That's JOSHUACUTCHIN.com. Um, I have a couple of things that I should probably plug coming up. I will be at Paracon, Kansas City on August 2nd. So we've got some time here. That website is paraconkc.com. Also have a film that's I was producer on coming out that is out currently until March, I think, called The Lady of the Lake, and that's available for video on demand in America. But anybody who wants to find out more about Fourth Wall Phantoms could visit joshuacutchin.com, and I should have more information, including a sort of lead up to the trailer announcement and cover reveal in a couple of weeks now, if everything proceeds as I hope it does. So looking forward
Excellent.
to it.
Excellent. If people while they're waiting for the book can go check out some of your other works like Ecology of the Souls. It's a great book. If you want more stuff kind of dealing with this, if you really like this conversation, you want more of that, Joshua's books are chock full of it. So you can check out his other work. As always, break the mold, conquer the realm, and thanks for listening.